Hey there, Alderwood. So good to be worshiping with you again. Hey, before we start, I just want to say on behalf of our pastors here that we are praying for you right now. This is a crazy time. It's divisive. It's a time of anxiety and just honestly, I think a lot of nervousness about what the future holds, where our country is at, how to best represent Jesus in this time. There's a lot of confusion about that. And I just want you to know from us that we love you. We're glad that we together get to be the hands and feet of Jesus in our communities, and we're praying for our church that we would do that in a way that really honors him in this tricky time in our country. And as we even have that in mind, we're going to jump into our series in the book of Romans right now. We're going to be taking a chunk of Romans at a time this year, and I'm really excited to be unpacking this book. It's so rich. It has so much truth that we need right now. We called this series Good News, and the reason for that is because that is what the gospel means. It means good news, and that is the reason why Paul writes this letter to the churches in Rome, so that they would understand the good news of who Jesus is, what he's done for them, and what that means for our lives. And we're going to see today that the gospel is good news that inspires boldness, that when we understand the truth of the gospel, it gives us boldness to share that message with the world around us. And the Apostle Paul, the author of Romans, is certainly a great example of that. I'm going to read our passage together, and I encourage you to grab a Bible, whether it's on your phone or your laptop or a paper Bible, and turn to Romans chapter 1. I'm going to be reading from verse 8, and it's not going to be on the screen, and so it's just for you to follow along in your Bible. Hit pause, go find one, do whatever you got to do, get a Bible in front of you, and let's read this passage together. This is the word of the Lord. Romans 1, verse 8 says this: "First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is being reported all over the world. God, whom I serve in my spirit in preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness how I constantly remember you in my prayers at all times. And I pray that now at last, by God's will, the way may be open for me to come to you. I long to see you so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that I planned many times to come to you, but have been prevented from doing so until now, in order that I might have a harvest among you, just as I have had among the other Gentiles. I am obligated both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish. That is why I am so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." Man, what a passage. So much here, so much awesome truth to live by. And I want to just kind of point out a couple things. And the first thing I want you to see in this passage is that Paul talks about his mission. He wants to come to Rome so that he can preach the gospel. This is what he does. He's an apostle. He's a sent one. And he says that he wants to come and preach to them. And the first thing to notice is that preaching the gospel, that sharing the good news of Jesus, is not just something we do with people who don't know Jesus. This is something we do with each other as believers. Did you catch that? Look at verses 11 and 12. It says this. He says, I long to see you. These are the churches in Rome. I long to see you so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. And Paul says, as I come to you to preach the gospel amongst these believers, we are going to encourage one another. Our faith is going to be built up, both me and you. I find that honestly just kind of astonishing, because the Apostle Paul is this pillar of the church. I mean, he is the one that Jesus appeared to personally, and he has been starting churches left and right all over the world. And there's this ragtag group of believers in Rome, probably not many of them, probably very young in their faith. And Paul says, look, when I come to you, I'm expecting that you are going to build me up. My faith is going to be encouraged by you. And this is how the body of Christ works. I want you to notice this, that Christians help each other grow. Even young Christians help mature Christians grow. And this is why at Alderwood we care so much about you getting into Christ-centered relationships here at this church. It doesn't have to be in a life group. It could be in a group that you're serving together with. It could be just a group of friends who are studying the Word together and praying for one another. But if you don't have that, if you don't have people in your life that are an encouragement to you or you're an encouragement to them, then we really do want to help you find that. That is what our life group ministry is all about. It's groups of Christians who are together in Christ-centered relationships, who are helping each other connect, grow, and go. That's that they connect with each other, they grow in their faith, and they go do what Jesus called us to do. If that sounds like something that you need in your life right now, you can go to alderwood.cc/groups. You can check out all the groups we have available, and we would love to help you find some Christian community to do this with. But enough of the PSA from the life groups, Pastor. Let's keep on looking at our text here. I want to get down to verses 16 and 17, and I know that that's further down in our text, but that really is the core of this passage, and these two verses are actually kind of our theme verses for this whole series, for the whole letter to the Romans that we're going to be reading over the next several months. It is Paul's statement in verses 16 and 17. Let's put 16 up on the screen. It says that, I am not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. I want you to pay attention to this first sentence here. I am not ashamed of the gospel. I'd love for you just to think for a second through the history of your life and all the experiences you had. What have been some of the most embarrassing moments for you? The moments where your face gets red, your skin crawls, your hands get sweaty, and everybody's eyes are on you, and you've maybe made a fool of yourself, or just that moment that you just cringe thinking about. What is that for you? For me, I think of a moment in high school. I was a senior in high school. I was the senior class president. I maybe thought of myself as somewhat popular, even though that probably wasn't true. But I was a part of this track team, and our high school track team was actually very successful. Our boys team that I was a part of had gone to state. I was able to make the cut for state just barely. I really wasn't that great of an athlete, but I did just barely make the cut in the event of javelin. And our team went to state. I competed. I got 8th place at state, which means that you earn 1 point for your team. And so I contributed 1 point to the track team, but because we had a lot of excellent athletes on the team who were not me, we actually won the state tournament. And so our boys track team were the state champions. And when we came back to our school that week, there was an all-school assembly to celebrate this athletic achievement of which I was a part. And they invited all the boys to come up on stage so that everybody could honor them. We could unroll the banner that was celebrating how great of athletes we all were. And the stage was a very long stage, and it had stairs on both ends, and it was about 3 feet tall. And I was kind of in the middle of the audience. And so with the whole school looking, I kind of run up to the stage, and rather than go to the stairs, I decided that I'm just going to kind of, hop up onto the stage because, I'm a state champion athlete. And so I walk up there, and I try to hop up, but my foot catches the edge of the stage, and I fall flat on my face in front of the entire school. And the irony of all ironies is this was at an event to celebrate my athletic achievements, okay? I just remember just being horrified. So embarrassed. And not only that, at that moment, I had to continue to stand on the stage and let the entire school stare at me because that was just the beginning of our time there. I was so embarrassed. I'm sure that you have some moments like that as well. And the reason I want you to think about that, I want you to imagine that feeling, because I think actually for many of us, that is some sort of the feeling that we start to feel when we think about sharing the gospel with people. If you're a follower of Jesus and you know that your job here on earth is to represent Jesus to the world around you, if we're honest, that's tough for a lot of us. When we're talking with a friend or a neighbor, when we're talking with somebody who maybe we don't know that well, and we're wondering where they stand with the Lord, and we maybe start thinking about, man, should I ask them about their faith? Should I tell them about what I believe? Should I talk about the fact that I go to church? We just have this tightness in our chest because we don't want to be embarrassed. And yet I really want us to see the Apostle Paul here because he boldly declares again, I am not ashamed of the gospel. So why is that? How does Paul have that boldness? And I want you to see that it's because of what he believes. He says, I am not ashamed of the gospel because he believes it is the power of God that brings salvation. So if we're going to have the beliefs that Paul has, if we're going to have the confidence to share the gospel with the people around us, both in the way we live and the way we speak, let's really dig into what he's saying is true about this good news. It is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. What does it mean that the gospel is the power of God that brings salvation? I think it means that Paul believes that the way that God is at work in the world, his power in the world to save people, it is being manifested through the message of what Jesus has done. God works in a lot of ways in a lot of different places, but he is saving people into relationship with himself through the message of Jesus that is being communicated through his church. What does it mean to be saved? That is a common Christian phrase. Maybe you've heard somebody share their testimony. They've talked about the day that they were saved. And we talked that way about conversion. What does this term actually mean? And one of the things that you'll notice as you read your Bible and you talk about salvation is you'll see that there is a past, present, and future aspect to this idea of salvation. If you're a follower of Jesus, it is simultaneously true that you have been saved, past tense. That there was a moment where you gave your life to Christ and you were in that moment saved from the power of sin. You were a slave to sin before that moment. And in that moment, Jesus saves you. He sets you free to be able to love God, to be able to walk with him and honor him with your life, to be free of the shackles of sin. That is true. And yet it is also true that if you're a follower of Jesus, you are being saved right now. Every day, a little bit more, you are becoming more like Jesus as the power of God works in your life. We call this sanctification. And it is the ongoing process of being made new. And while that is true, it is simultaneously true again that you will in the future be saved once and for all. When the end times come, when Jesus returns, you will be declared righteous, entering into life with God, saved from the consequences of sin and the wrath of God. You have been saved, you are being saved, you will be saved. And this is the power of the gospel in your life. All that happens through the grace of God because of Jesus. And yet, I think for a lot of us, as we think about that word salvation, we think about the gospel, there's this tendency that I've noticed amongst maybe churches like us in the West, in America, in the last several decades, and that is to condense the idea of salvation to simply being saved from hell. I have some memories of people sharing the gospel with me that way when I was a kid, and I grew up in church, and I remember being in Sunday school with some awesome people. I mean, so well-meaning, people whose faith is probably well beyond my own, and yet I do have some kind of funny memories of like being a 9-year-old in children's ministry and, the gospel message being shared with the group of 9-year-olds that I'm a part of. And, we're gathering all the kids, everybody's sitting on the floor, and it's time for the Sunday school teacher to share the message. And the Sunday school teacher says, we're going to talk about the gospel today. And the gospel, kids, is that all of you are sinners who are completely hopeless. You're going to hell without Jesus. And kids, do you know what hell is? Hell is the place where there's eternal fire and everything's burning all the time, but you never die and you just suffer for eternity. And how could we imagine this? Let's see. Has anybody ever burned themselves? Oh, Timmy, yes. Timmy, what happened to you? And Timmy says, one day I accidentally touched the stove and it burned my finger. And we're like, good, Timmy. So it's just like that. Imagine that, but all over your body forever. But good news, because of Jesus, you can go to heaven if you believe in him where your parents will be. And so who wants to give their life to Jesus today? And every kid wanted to give their life to Jesus, myself included. I think I became a Christian 20 times that year. And yet there's this issue, and I don't know how that story makes you feel. I mean, maybe you think that's how it should be done, but I, at least for myself, noticed some problems with that, which is that when the gospel gets reduced to simply a get out of hell free card, it completely is separated from the good news of the fact that we get to be with God. We get to know him and be in relationship with him and love him and experience his love in our life. We get to be restored and actually freed from our own sin, freed from the power of sin in us that makes us just a shell of ourselves the way that God wanted us to be. And this simplified gospel, often it leads to lives where we don't actually change anything about how we live, how we think, what we love. We just think that one day we're going to go to heaven when we die. And that is not the good news that Jesus has for us. The good news is that you were created to be with him. and that sin breaks that, and yet because of the cross, because of what Jesus has done, you can be made new. You can be restored to the person that God made you to be, to relationship with him, to love him, to worship him, and to be clean. And yes, to go to heaven and be with Jesus forever in the new heavens and the new earth, and not suffer the consequence of the wrath of God in hell. But it is so much more than that. And Paul wants you to know that the gospel is the power of God to work true, whole salvation in your life, in every respect, from the moment you're saved on through eternity. And what else do we see in verse 16 here? It says that this power of God that brings salvation is for everyone who believes. This is so crucial about the good news of the gospel. It is for everyone. It is for you, no matter if you're a Jew or a Gentile, if you're rich or poor, if you're gay or straight, no matter your ethnicity, your religion, your nationality, your political party. It is for everyone in your neighborhood, everyone in your apartment complex, every nation on earth. This message of salvation is the power of God for them if they believe. And let's continue on in verse 17 to see what happens as people respond to this message. He says, "For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed." And I want to take a look at that phrase with you for a second, because the righteousness of God is so key to what Paul is talking about. And that word righteousness is one that maybe you've heard before, but is not quite as easy as to define. And when we talk about righteousness, often we talk about our own righteousness as followers of Jesus. And we're talking about the righteousness of human beings. We're talking about being in right relationship with God. And you'll note that that word righteousness, it has the root right? So it's about making things right and being right. And so our righteousness is being in right relationship with God and living rightly. But what is the righteousness of God? It's not talking about our righteousness, it's talking about his righteousness. And this is a phrase that gets used throughout the Old Testament, and it refers to the attribute of God where God does what is right and he makes things right. So this is our definition of God's righteousness. The righteousness of God is God doing what is right and making things right. And this shows up in the Old Testament as time and time again the prophets promise that one day God is going to make things right. We see the brokenness around us. We see the sin in this world. We see the fact that we continually do the things we don't want to do, and we're trapped in this sin nature that we have. And the prophets say, I promise you that God's righteousness declares that he will make things right. And Paul, back to verse 17, is saying this, that the message of the gospel is that happening, that his righteousness, his work to make things right in the world, it is revealed in the message of Jesus. And this righteousness, once again, is for those who believe, right? He says it's a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. If you want to be a part of God making things right, if you want him to make you right, it is for those who believe, who have faith in Jesus. Well, I want to circle back with you to what we saw with Paul when he says, I am unashamed. He's unashamed because he believes this message to be true, that the message of Jesus really is the power of God to save people who respond to it in faith. And so he declares it everywhere, and his life is proof of that, right? Paul goes around declaring the gospel to anyone who will listen, even when they reject him, even when they beat him up, even when they stone him and leave him for dead, even when they imprison him without cause. I mean, he always comes back. He keeps on sharing the message. And this is where I want to turn things on you just for a moment. Before we kind of come to a conclusion and talk about our own response, I want you to think for yourself. What are some of the reasons that you might be ashamed of the gospel? When you think about sharing the good news of Jesus with somebody in your life, when you think about that conversation, when you think about the moments around talking about faith where you start to feel that tightness in your chest, where does that come from? I'm going to give you just a couple minutes to talk with the people you're around right now, or even if you're on your own, just to think yourself. But what is it about sharing the gospel of Jesus with people that makes you start to be nervous? Take a couple minutes and talk about that. All right, welcome back. Feel free to hit pause if you want to take a little bit more time. But I wonder some of the things that you brought up about what makes you nervous potentially, that requires boldness for you if you're going to share the gospel. I want to think just for a second about the fact that we're not the first people to have to wrestle with this, right? Paul was talking to churches in Rome of Christians who were reading this for themselves, and I bet you they experienced this same thing too. I want you to think about the world they lived in for a second. We know that in the early church, Christianity spread mostly among the poor, that these followers of Jesus who were reading this letter for the first time, many of them likely were slaves, and they were in the Roman Empire. And as they were potentially thinking about sharing this good news of Jesus, the true king who has all power, they were doing that in the shadow of the empire of Caesar. If they looked up the hill behind them, they would see the palace of Nero. I want to show you a photo of this. This is a reconstruction of Nero's palace that was off in the distance for any of these Roman Christians as they were talking to their neighbors. And you will just see the absolute luxury and over the top, out of control spending that went into this place. If you'll notice right here, this is actually an artificial lake that was built inside his palace, where they built a ship that floats in it, even though it can't go anywhere because it's in an indoor lake. If you notice up here, maybe it's a little bit tough for you to see, but this is a over 100-foot tall bronze statue of Nero himself that sat in the courtyard. And in fact, this place was so over the top that future Caesars actually tore it down because they were too embarrassed by it. They thought it was too much of a risk for people to see them living in that degree of luxury when others were poor. They thought people might revolt. And so just imagine being a Roman Christian, sharing the news of the King Jesus with people who live in this guy's Rome. I think they might look at you and say, look, you're a slave. What is your king even doing for you? The Roman Empire is doing just fine with the king we have. Thank you very much. I think it might take some level of boldness to be able to share the truth of Jesus with somebody. We don't live in that environment, though, and I wonder what you answered. I think for many of us, we'd have different answers to this question of what makes us nervous, what requires our boldness. But I think there's two things that really came to mind for me in that question. The first one is this. It's that we don't want to look judgmental. Okay, we don't want to be seen as that Christian who's, just judging what everybody does, has opinions about everybody's behavior and thinks we're better than them. I think we're afraid of looking hypocritical in that. I think we're afraid of being seen as somebody who holds to a certain morality when maybe people might look at our life and see that we don't have it all together, that we have some flaws. And so I think there's this fear that if we talk about Jesus with somebody, that they are going to think that we're just a judgmental person. But I want you to hear this. There is nothing judgmental about sharing the hope of Jesus with somebody. In fact, if you're a follower of Jesus, it means that you know that you are a sinner, that you are desperately in need of the salvation that Jesus offers, that you are hopelessly lost without him. So rather than us representing Jesus by pointing our finger at everybody else, let's share the gospel by pointing the finger at ourselves, saying, I follow Jesus because I need him, and I wonder if you may as well. The second thing I think that ties us up is that we don't want to look stupid. And maybe this is because you wonder if you can answer everybody's questions, and you wonder if you can explain your faith in a way that's compelling, and maybe there's a little bit afraid that somebody's going to pick you apart or ask you a question that you can't answer. And I think this is compounded by the fact that we live in a society where there's almost this kind of intellectual superiority to people who reject Christianity and reject faith of any kind. Like there's this smart group of people who are able to see the world for what it is, that there is no God, and then there's these silly, simple-minded people who believe in an invisible being who controls the world. And maybe we're afraid of being seen that way. But I just want you to hear the confidence that comes with knowing that God created this universe. Whether people believe in him or not, he is real and they do live in his world. And your job is not to convince them of that. Your job is to represent Jesus and just share the message. It's the Holy Spirit's job to do the work of producing faith in people's lives. And our job is not to be the perfect person to explain it, but just to be faithful and to represent what Jesus has done in our life. So the question for you as you think about that is, how can you live with the boldness that Paul has? As you look around the world that God's put you in, the people he's put in your life, what does it look like for you to faithfully share the gospel with the way you live, with the way you speak to the people that God has intentionally placed you around to be the light of the world to them? I want to leave you with what Paul said in verse 14, just before these verses. He says, I am obligated both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish. Paul sees himself as a servant of Christ who's obligated to share the good news of Jesus with the people that God has given him the opportunity to do that. Paul does not believe that anybody gets to receive the good news of Jesus and withhold that from others. That is the same for us. So who are you obligated to? And as you talk about this message, as you hang out with other followers of Jesus this week, I'd love for you to talk about this question. Who do you need boldness to share the gospel with right now? Pray. Ask God to put on your heart the relationship, the friend, the person in your life where you know that God has you there for a reason, and pray for boldness to represent Jesus to them. Church, I love you. I cannot wait to see you again in person, and we're praying for you as we represent Jesus in the city around us. Can't wait to worship with you again next week. Until then, let's follow Jesus together.